Every few years, the debate resurfaces in America. Why don't we have high-speed trains like Japan, France, or China? The question seems especially pressing when Americans travel abroad and experience trains that routinely cruise at 180 to 220 miles per hour, making the journey from Paris to Lyon or Tokyo or Osaka in just a couple of hours. Then they return home to Amtrak Acela, America's fastest train, which averages just 70 miles per hour on its trip from Boston to Washington, D.C., despite being technically capable of 150 miles per hour. On most other American passenger routes, trains rarely exceed 79 miles per hour. A common suggestion emerges: why not just run high-speed trains on America's existing 140,000 miles of railroad tracks? After all, the infrastructure is already there, we just need better trains, right? Well, unfortunately, the answer is far more complicated. Today, we're diving into the fascinating technical, historical, and economic reasons why America's existing rail infrastructure simply cannot support true high-speed rail, and what it would actually take to bring 200-mile-per-hour trains to the United States. What makes rail high-speed? Before we dive into America's challenges, let's establish what high-speed rail actually means. According to international standards, high-speed rail systems operate at minimum speeds of 124 miles per hour or 200 kilometers per hour on dedicated tracks, or 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour on upgraded conventional tracks. The world's fastest commercial trains now regularly operate at speeds of 217 miles per hour in China, France, Japan, and several other countries. These aren't just slightly faster versions of conventional trains, they represent fundamentally different systems engineered from the ground up for speed, efficiency, and safety. Today, there are over 35,000 miles of high-speed rail lines in operation globally. China alone has built over 23,500 miles since 2008, more than the rest of the world combined. Meanwhile, the United States has exactly 0 miles of track that meet international standards for true high-speed rail. The Acela Express, which runs between Boston and Washington, D.C., reaches 150 miles per hour, but only for a total of about 34 miles in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Its average speed over the entire route is now just 70 miles per hour, slower than driving in light traffic. Dr. Christopher Barkin, Executive Director of the Rail Transportation and Engineering Center at the University of Illinois, explains the fundamental challenge. High-speed rail isn't just conventional rail moving faster, it's a completely different engineering approach to everything from track design to signaling systems to the geometry of curves. Our existing infrastructure simply wasn't built with these principles in mind. The historical legacy. To understand why America's tracks can't support high speeds, we need to look back at how and why they were built. The United States developed its rail system primarily in the 19th century, with different priorities than modern high-speed systems. From the 1830s through the early 1900s, America built the world's largest rail network, peaking at over 254,000 miles of track, more than enough to circle the Earth 10 times. But these tracks were designed primarily to connect far-flung settlements and transport freight across vast distances, not to move passengers at high speeds. Henry Posner III, chairman of Railroad Development Corporation and former Conrail manager, provides context. American railroads were built to connect a developing continent as economically as possible. That meant following the contours of the land, using tight curves when necessary, and crossing other transportation routes at grade. None of these practices are compatible with modern high-speed operation. Unlike modern high-speed routes, which require extremely straight tracks with large radius curves and minimal grade changes, America's railroads snake through mountains, wind around obstacles, and follow river valleys to minimize construction costs. This historical approach made perfect sense for the 19th century America when the alternative was a horse-drawn wagon moving at 3 miles per hour. Even a train averaging 25 miles per hour represented a revolutionary improvement. Building for much higher speeds would have greatly increased costs with minimal additional benefit at the time. Moreover, America's rail system evolved to prioritize freight transportation, unlike Europe and Asia where passenger service traditionally took precedence. Today, freight rail accounts for approximately 40% of all U.S. long-distance cargo movement by ton miles, while passenger rail represents less than 1% of intercity travel. The technical obstacles. Let's examine the specific technical reasons why existing American tracks can't support true high-speed rail service. First and foremost is the issue of track geometry, particularly curves. High-speed trains require curves with extremely large radii to prevent excessive centrifugal forces that would make passengers uncomfortable and potentially derail trains. For a train traveling at 125 miles per hour, curves need a minimum radius of around 1.2 miles. At 220 miles per hour, that increases to nearly 4 miles. Most American rail lines were built with curve radii of a quarter mile or less, which limit speeds to about 80 to 90 miles per hour, regardless of how powerful the train is. As Sarah Feinberg, former administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, explained in a 2016 interview, "You can put the most advanced train in the world on our existing tracks, but the laws of physics still apply. It will have to slow down for curves just like any other train." Curves can be banked or super elevated in railroad terminology to partially counteract centrifugal force, but there are strict limits to this approach. Excessive superelevation would cause slow-moving trains, like the freight trains that share most American tracks, to put dangerous pressure on the inside rail. Track alignment is another critical factor. High-speed rail requires extraordinarily precise track construction and maintenance, with vertical and horizontal deviations measured in millimeters. Most American tracks have alignment tolerances measured in inches, sufficient for freight trains moving at 60 miles per hour, but dangerous for passenger trains at triple that speed. And then there's the issue of grade crossings, places where roads and railroads intersect at the same level. America has approximately 210,000 railroad crossings, and about 129,000 of them are public highway rail crossings. High-speed rail systems eliminate these entirely through bridges, tunnels, and other grade separation techniques. At 220 miles per hour, a train travels the length of a football field in about 1 second, making grade crossings extremely dangerous. A vehicle or pedestrian on the tracks would have no time to react, and the train operator would have no chance to stop. Electrification represents another fundamental challenge. All modern high-speed trains are electric, drawing power from overhead catenary wires, but just 1% of America's railroad network is electrified, primarily in the Northeast Corridor and a few commuter rail systems. Converting the existing nationwide network would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The freight compatibility problem. Perhaps the most significant obstacle to using existing tracks for high-speed rail is America's heavy freight traffic. Unlike many countries where passenger rail has priority, most American tracks outside the Northeast Corridor are owned by freight railroads. Heavy freight trains, sometimes weighing over 20,000 tons, cause different types of track deformation than the lighter, faster passenger trains. This creates a difficult engineering compromise. Tracks optimized for heavy freight don't work well for high-speed passenger service and vice versa. Katie Farmer, CEO of BNSF Railroad, one of America's largest freight railroads, describes the challenge. Mixing 220 mile per hour passenger trains with 30 mile per hour freight trains on the same tracks creates enormous operational complexity. The speed differential alone makes it nearly impossible to maintain reliable schedules for either service. This scheduling nightmare is easily visualized. A high-speed train traveling at 220 miles per hour would catch up to a freight train moving at 55 miles per hour in just a few minutes. Without separate tracks, the faster train would need to slow down to match the freight train speed until an opportunity to pass became available. European and Asian high-speed systems solved this problem by building dedicated passenger tracks or by severely limiting freight traffic. In France, for example, freight represents only about 10% of total rail traffic, compared to over 90% in the United States. There are also physical compatibility problems between freight and high-speed rail. American freight railroads use taller, wider equipment than most other countries, a practice known as excess height or excess width cars. These larger dimensions can make it difficult to install the overhead electrical systems required for high-speed trains while maintaining sufficient clearance for the freight cars. The FRA regulations. Beyond the physical limitations, regulatory factors also prevent high-speed operations on existing tracks. The Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, has stringent safety regulations that differ significantly from those in countries with established high-speed rail systems. Historically, American passenger trains have been required to meet extremely high buff strength standards, the ability to withstand compressive forces during a collision. This resulted in much heavier trains than their European or Asian counterparts, which instead focused on crash avoidance and compartmentalized crash management. A traditional American passenger locomotive might weigh 150 to 200 tons, while a European high-speed power car of similar capability might weigh half as much. Heavier trains require more energy to accelerate, have more difficulty navigating curves, and cause more track wear. Dr. Alan Zarembitsky, director of the Railroad Engineering and Safety Program at the University of Delaware, explains the philosophical difference. U.S. regulations historically focused on crash survival, building trains strong enough to withstand collisions. European and Asian systems focused on crash avoidance, using advanced signaling and dedicated tracks to prevent collisions from happening in the first place. In recent years, the FRA has begun modernizing its approach, allowing lighter weight trains that meet alternative safety standards when equipped with technologies like positive train control. However, these changes alone don't overcome the fundamental track geometry and freight compatibility issues. The FRA also imposes strict speed restrictions based on signaling systems. Most American rail lines use traditional signaling that divides tracks into blocks that can contain one train at a time. These systems typically limit trains to 79 miles per hour. Higher speeds require more advanced signaling systems not represented on most existing tracks. The California high-speed rail example. California's ongoing effort to build high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco perfectly illustrates why existing tracks won't work for true high-speed service. When planning began, the natural question was, why not use existing tracks through populated areas to save money? Engineers quickly determined that doing so would require significant speed reductions, undermining the entire purpose of high-speed rail. Brian Kelly, CEO of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, explained the decision. Existing rail corridors through cities like Fresno or Bakersfield have dozens of grade crossings, tight curves, and adjacent buildings. Converting these for high-speed operation would require either massive demolition of urban neighborhoods or speed restrictions that would defeat the purpose of the project. The California project also demonstrates the land requirements for true high-speed rail. High-speed tracks need a wider right-of-way than conventional rail, typically about 100 feet, to accommodate gentle curves, proper drainage, and safety buffer zones. Existing rail corridors, especially in urban areas, often have much narrower rights-of-way. Even in California's relatively flat Central Valley, building true high-speed infrastructure has proven enormously challenging. Existing tracks couldn't simply be upgraded, they had to be completely rebuilt with different alignment, grade separation, and support systems. The result has been a project that's now estimated to cost over $100 billion and won't be completed until the 2030s at the earliest. A powerful illustration of why just upgrading existing tracks isn't a viable solution for true high-speed rail. The Northeast Corridor limitations. The Northeast Corridor between Boston, New York, and Washington provides America's closest approximation of high-speed rail and clearly demonstrates the limitations of trying to achieve high speeds on legacy infrastructure. Despite decades of investment, Amtrak's Acela trains reached their top speed of 150 miles per hour on just 34 miles of the 457-mile route. Even with the most advanced trains available, the average speed remains only about 70 miles per hour due to track constraints. Some of these constraints are obvious. The corridor includes infrastructure dating back to the 19th century, such as the Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel opened in 1873, and the original Hudson River tunnels opened in 1910. These structures have tight curves, limited clearances, and antiquated designs that severely restrict speeds. Other limitations are less visible but equally significant. Track curvature that follows geographic features and development patterns established over 150 years ago, complex interlockings where different rail lines converge, and shared use with commuter and freight trains. Amtrak's plan to achieve true high-speed service on the Northeast Corridor, called the Next Generation High-Speed Rail Program, essentially acknowledges that the existing alignment cannot support desired speeds. Instead, it proposes building an entirely new right-of-way for substantial portions of the route at an estimated cost over $100 billion. Stephen Gardner, president of Amtrak, frames the challenge. We're operating 21st century trains on 19th century infrastructure. Despite billions in investment, we've reached the limits of what existing alignments can support. True high-speed rail would require new, dedicated infrastructure built to modern standards. The cost of starting fresh. If existing tracks won't work, What would it cost to build a proper high-speed rail system in the United States? The numbers are sobering but instructive. International experience suggests that building high-speed rail from scratch typically costs between $25 million and $80 million per mile, depending on terrain, land costs, and engineering challenges. Urban segments with tunnels and elevated structures can exceed $200 million per mile. For a hypothetical 400-mile high-speed line connecting Chicago and St. Louis, replacing an existing Amtrak route currently limited to 79 miles per hour, the cost would likely exceed $20 billion, assuming average costs of $50 million per mile. That's roughly 40 times the cost of upgrading the existing freight tracks for slightly improved conventional service. Dr. David Levinson, professor of transport engineering at the University of Sydney and former University of Minnesota transport researcher, provides context. The United States faces much higher costs for new rail infrastructure than most countries due to land acquisition expenses, legal challenges, complex regulations, and higher labor costs. This makes the benefit-cost equation for high-speed rail particularly challenging. China invests approximately $100 billion annually in high-speed rail infrastructure, more than the United States has spent on all passenger rail capital improvements over the past 50 years combined. Even European countries, with much smaller populations and economies, typically invest several billion dollars annually in their high-speed networks. The geographic and demographic realities of the United States also present challenges. Outside the Northeast Corridor and a few other metropolitan regions, population densities are significantly lower than in areas with successful high-speed rail systems. This affects both construction costs, longer distances between cities, and potential ridership, fewer people to actually serve. Bright spots and potential solutions. Now, despite these challenges, there are several promising developments that could bring improved rail service, if not true high-speed rail, to American travelers in the coming years. Brightline in Florida represents a promising private sector approach. While not true high-speed rail by international standards, top speed 125 miles per hour, Brightline has successfully launched service between Miami and West Palm Beach, with an extension to Orlando now complete. They've achieved this by upgrading existing freight corridors where possible, but building entirely new tracks where necessary. The company's planned Brightline West project between Las Vegas and Southern California would be a true high-speed system operating at up to 200 miles per hour, but notably, it will require all new dedicated tracks rather than using existing rail lines. The proposed Texas Central Railway between Dallas and Houston represents another private sector initiative for true high-speed rail. This project would use Japanese Shinkansen technology and, like Brightline West, would require an entirely new dedicated right-of-way. In 2021, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included $66 billion for passenger rail, the largest federal investment in rail since the creation of Amtrak in 1971. While not enough to build a nationwide high-speed network, this funding could significantly improve service on existing corridors and potentially support new dedicated high-speed segments in key markets. Perhaps the most realistic near-term approach is what some experts call higher speed rail, conventional trains operating at 90 to 125 miles per hour on significantly upgraded existing tracks. This approach, while not matching the 200 mile per hour speeds of systems in China or Europe, could still dramatically improve American passenger rail without the cost of an entirely new infrastructure. Andy Kuhns, president of the U.S. High-Speed Rail Association, advocates for a mixed approach. We need to be strategic about where we invest. Some corridors justify true high-speed rail with entirely new infrastructure. Others would benefit from substantial upgrades to existing tracks. The key is matching the approach to the market while maintaining connectivity between different speed tiers. Closing thoughts. The dream of American bullet trains zooming along existing rail corridors at 200 miles per hour is, unfortunately, just that, a dream. The technical, regulatory, and operational realities we've explored make it clear that true high-speed rail requires purpose-built infrastructure designed specifically for high-speed operation. This doesn't mean America can't have high-speed rail, just that we can't take shortcuts. Countries with successful high-speed rail systems make deliberate, long-term commitments to building the necessary infrastructure, accepting that the benefits would accrue over decades rather than years. The question isn't whether high-speed trains can technically operate in America. Clearly they can. The real question is whether Americans are willing to make the investments necessary to build a truly modern passenger rail system. separate from the 19th century freight network that serves us well for moving goods, but will never accommodate 21st century passenger speeds. The tracks that connected America in the age of steam cannot serve us effectively in the age of high-speed electric trains, not without fundamental transformation that goes far beyond simply running faster trains on existing rails.